November 12, 1961. United Nations Headquarters, New York City. Lieutenant Colonel Dmitri Fyodorovich Polyakov, 41 years old, a career officer in the GRU, Soviet military intelligence, walked through the corridors of the UN building with the purposeful stride of someone who had made a decision and would not retreat from it. Polyakov held a cover position with the UN Military Staff Committee, ostensibly working on technical military liaison matters between the Permanent Security Council members. In reality, his assignment was standard GRU practice. Use the UN posting as cover for intelligence operations in the United States. But on this November day in 1961, Polyakov intended to do something that would have seemed incomprehensible to his GRU superiors. He had arranged, through intermediaries, a private meeting with an agent of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Not to probe for weaknesses in American security, not to assess the FBI agent as a potential recruitment target. Polyakov intended to offer his services to American intelligence. The meeting occurred in a location chosen for discretion. The FBI agent, whose name remains classified even decades later, listened as Polyakov explained his offer. The Soviet officer spoke carefully, aware that every word would be analyzed for signs of deception, for indications that he might be a dangle, a false defector sent by Soviet intelligence to feed disinformation while identifying American intelligence methods. Polyakov's proposal was straightforward but extraordinary. He would remain in place as a Soviet officer, continuing his GRU career, maintaining his cover, operating within the Soviet system. But he would provide intelligence to the United States about Soviet military capabilities, weapons development, intelligence operations, and anything else he could access through his position and career advancement. He wasn't defecting. He was offering to become an agent in place, the most valuable type of intelligence source, because he would continue to have access to current information rather than only historical knowledge from before defection. The FBI agent's immediate question addressed motivation. Soviet intelligence officers who volunteered their services typically sought money, sought protection from political problems, or faced personal crises that made continued service to the Soviet Union untenable. Polyakov's answer departed from every normal pattern. He wasn't seeking substantial payment, though he would accept modest amounts to make the relationship appear normal to anyone who might detect it. He wasn't fleeing political persecution. He wasn't in personal trouble. Polyakov stated his motivation simply: "I believe my country is heading in the wrong direction. The system has become corrupt. Those at the top serve themselves rather than the people. Someone must try to change it, even if only in small ways. I cannot change the Soviet Union from outside, but perhaps intelligence I provide will enable America to make better decisions, to understand us better, and that understanding might contribute to better outcomes." The ideological motivation was rare, but not unprecedented. Some of the most valuable spies in intelligence history had been motivated by principle rather than payment. But it also raised suspicions. Soviet intelligence had certainly crafted elaborate dangles before, and an offer this valuable naturally triggered skepticism. The FBI agent made no commitments during the initial meeting. He would report Polyakov's approach to his superiors. The FBI would investigate thoroughly. If Polyakov was genuine, further contact would be established. If he was assessed as a Soviet operation, the FBI would handle him carefully to avoid revealing American counterintelligence capabilities. The vetting process consumed weeks. FBI counterintelligence analyzed everything about Polyakov: his career, his family, his statements, his behavior, searching for indicators of deception. The assessment concluded that Polyakov appeared genuine. His offer seemed sincere rather than orchestrated. The FBI contacted the CIA, the agency responsible for foreign intelligence operations. If Polyakov was authentic, CIA would assume control of the operation. CIA officers met with Polyakov in December 1961. They assigned him the cryptonym Top Hat, later redesignated BOURBON in CIA records. The questioning was extensive, probing for weaknesses in his story, testing his knowledge, assessing his access to valuable information. Polyakov answered every question, provided samples of the intelligence he could access, and demonstrated detailed knowledge of Soviet military operations that would be difficult to fabricate convincingly. By early 1962, CIA had made its decision. Polyakov was accepted as an agent. The relationship that would last 19 years, produce intelligence that shaped American strategic policy throughout the Cold War, and end with Polyakov's execution by firing squad had begun. To understand why Polyakov became what CIA Director William Casey would later call the most valuable source of the Cold War, you need to understand his background, his access, and the convictions that motivated him to risk everything. Dmitri Fyodorovich Polyakov was born in 1921 in Ukraine. He entered Soviet military service in 1939, receiving officer training as war with Germany approached. When the Great Patriotic War, World War II, commenced in June 1941, Polyakov served as a junior officer in combat operations. He survived the war, emerging with combat decorations and the experience that shaped his generation of Soviet officers. In 1946, Polyakov joined the GRU, Soviet Military Intelligence. The GRU, distinct from the better-known KGB, focused on military and technical intelligence, rather than political intelligence and internal security. GRU officers operated abroad under diplomatic cover or posing as trade representatives, collecting information about foreign military capabilities, weapons systems, and strategic planning. The organization was smaller than KGB but highly professional, recruiting officers from military backgrounds rather than party apparatchiks. Polyakov's career advancement followed typical patterns for promising GRU officers. He received assignments in East Germany during the 1950s, where he conducted intelligence operations against NATO forces. He served in China from 1962 to 1965, a critical period when Sino-Soviet relations were deteriorating and Chinese nuclear weapons development was accelerating. Each assignment expanded his knowledge, his access, and his value to Western intelligence once he began cooperating. His technical intelligence expertise made him particularly valuable. Polyakov understood Soviet weapons systems deeply, not just surface details that might appear in propaganda, but actual capabilities, limitations, and development timelines. This technical knowledge enabled him to provide intelligence CIA couldn't obtain through signals intercepts or satellite reconnaissance. Technical documents, engineering specifications, and performance data from Soviet testing programs were accessible to someone in Polyakov's position. The ideology that motivated Polyakov's decision to work with American intelligence developed gradually rather than from a single catalyzing event. He had observed Soviet system failures throughout his career. The purges of the 1930s had devastated military leadership. World War II had exposed weaknesses in Soviet military organization and equipment. Post-war reconstruction revealed the gap between propaganda claims about socialist prosperity and actual living conditions Soviet citizens endured. Khrushchev's de-Stalinization campaign in the 1950s briefly suggested reform was possible. But when Khrushchev was ousted in 1964 and the system reverted to patterns Polyakov considered corrupt, he concluded that the Soviet system was fundamentally broken. The leadership served itself rather than the Soviet people. The Communist Party claimed to represent workers, while party officials lived in privilege ordinary citizens could never imagine. The military, which Polyakov had devoted his life to serving, was controlled by political officers more concerned with ideological correctness than effectiveness. Polyakov believed in Russia. He believed in his country's people and potential, but he had stopped believing in the Communist Party and the Soviet system. His decision to work with American intelligence reflected the conclusion that someone had to try to change the system's trajectory, even if only marginally, even if only through enabling American policymakers to make better informed decisions that might reduce tensions and create conditions where reform became possible. His family situation created constant tension. Polyakov's wife and children remained in Moscow throughout his career. Standard Soviet practice for intelligence officers serving abroad. The family connection ensured loyalty through implicit threat. If an officer defected or was suspected of betrayal, The family faced consequences ranging from loss of privileges to imprisonment or worse. Every communication with CIA, every document Polyakov provided, every meeting he attended, risked not just his own life, but his family's welfare. His GRU position in 1961, assignment to the UN Military Staff Committee, provided cover for intelligence operations, while giving him legitimate reasons to travel and communicate. The position itself wasn't particularly sensitive, but his GRU status meant he would receive assignments that rotated him through various positions throughout his career, some of which would provide extraordinary access to information American intelligence desperately needed. The decision to remain in place rather than defect reflected careful calculation. Defection would provide CIA with Polyakov's knowledge as of the defection date, but that information would age rapidly as Soviet systems and plans evolved. Remaining in place as an active officer enabled Polyakov to provide current intelligence continuously. The risk was immeasurably higher. Remaining in the Soviet system meant constant exposure to counterintelligence scrutiny. Any behavioral deviation could trigger investigation, and discovery meant certain execution. But Polyakov judged that he could accomplish more by staying than by running. The initial FBI contact in 1961 had been Polyakov's decision. He approached American authorities without prompting, without being targeted for recruitment, without external pressure. The voluntary nature of his offer was both unusual and reassuring to American intelligence. Officers who volunteer often prove more reliable than those recruited through coercion or compromise, because their motivation is internal rather than external. CIA assumed control of the operation in 1962 with realistic understanding of both the opportunity and risks. Polyakov could provide extraordinary intelligence if he survived, but handling an agent this valuable required meticulous operational security, infrequent contact to minimize exposure, and constant assessment to ensure he hadn't been turned or compromised. For the next 19 years, that's exactly what happened. The intelligence Dmitri Polyakov provided between 1962 and 1980 shaped American strategic planning, weapons development, arms control negotiations, and military doctrine in ways that remained classified for decades after his execution. Soviet intercontinental ballistic missile development was among the most critical intelligence requirements for American strategic planners during the Cold War. Understanding Soviet ICBM capabilities, how many missiles they had, what ranges they could achieve, how accurate they were, what warheads they carried, was essential for American strategic force planning and arms control negotiations. Satellite reconnaissance could photograph missile silos and launch facilities, but it couldn't reveal performance characteristics, production rates, or future development plans. Polyakov provided detailed intelligence on the SS-11 Sago ICBM, the backbone of Soviet strategic forces during the 1960s and 1970s. He supplied specifications on the SS-13 Savage, the Soviet Union's first solid-fuel ICBM. He provided data on the SS-17 Spanker, SS-18 Satan, and SS-19 Stiletto missiles that would form the Soviet strategic arsenal in the 1970s and 1980s. The intelligence included technical specifications, performance parameters, production schedules, and deployment plans that American intelligence couldn't obtain through technical collection means. This information directly influenced American strategic weapons development. Understanding Soviet missile accuracy enabled American planners to assess vulnerability of Minuteman ICBM silos and adjust basing modes accordingly. Knowing Soviet throw weight, the total mass a missile could lift, informed debates about whether the United States needed heavier missiles or could rely on smaller, more accurate weapons. The intelligence shaped arms control negotiations, enabling American negotiators to verify Soviet claims and identify areas where Soviet statements contradicted actual capabilities. Anti-ballistic missile systems intelligence provided insight into Soviet air defense and strategic defense programs. Polyakov supplied information on SA-2 and SA-5 surface-to-air missile systems, including their capabilities against ballistic missiles. This intelligence informed American ABM treaty negotiations, helping establish verification provisions and limitations on systems both sides would accept. Understanding what Soviet systems could actually do, as opposed to what Soviet propaganda claimed, enabled realistic assessment of strategic balance. Soviet military doctrine intelligence revealed operational plans for potential conflict in Europe. Polyakov provided documents detailing Soviet assumptions about how war with NATO would begin, what objectives Soviet forces would pursue, what tactics they would employ. NATO adjusted defensive plans accordingly, positioning forces to counter expected Soviet approaches, rather than defending against theoretical scenarios. The intelligence probably deterred Soviet aggression by demonstrating that NATO understood Soviet plans and was prepared to counter them. Chemical and biological weapons programs. Intelligence violated international treaties both superpowers had signed. Polyakov provided samples of chemical agents Soviet forces were stockpiling, documentation of biological weapons research programs, and evidence that Soviet declarations to international monitoring bodies were deliberately false. The intelligence enabled American defensive programs to develop protective equipment and detection systems matched to actual Soviet capabilities rather than assumed threats. The China assignment from 1962 to 1965 provided Polyakov with unique insights into Sino-Soviet relations during the critical period when the split between communist powers became irreversible. He reported on Soviet nuclear technology transfers to China, on disputes between Soviet and Chinese leadership, on military tensions along the Sino-Soviet border. This intelligence informed American policy toward both communist powers, enabling strategies that exploited the split, rather than treating the communist bloc as monolithic. Soviet espionage operations intelligence may have been Polyakov's most immediately actionable contribution. He identified Soviet agents operating in the West, provided organizational charts of GRU structures revealing how Soviet military intelligence functioned, and warned about KGB operations targeting American intelligence. Some of these warnings led directly to arrests. Others enabled FBI counterintelligence to monitor Soviet operations and feed disinformation back through compromised channels. Specific examples from declassified CIA documents illustrate the value. Polyakov identified several Soviet penetrations of Western intelligence services, leading to investigations that revealed long-running espionage operations. He provided technical documents on Soviet weapon systems that enabled American engineers to develop countermeasures matched to actual Soviet capabilities rather than theoretical assessments. He warned about Soviet biological weapons research programs, providing the evidence that led to public exposure of Soviet treaty violations. The assessment by CIA leadership was unequivocal. William Casey, CIA director during the Reagan administration, stated publicly after the Cold War that Polyakov provided more useful intelligence than any other source during the entire Cold War period. Intelligence community consensus holds that Polyakov's contributions shortened the Cold War by years, preventing Soviet strategic surprise while enabling American policymakers to negotiate from positions of knowledge rather than uncertainty. The operational security Polyakov maintained was remarkable considering 19 years of active espionage. He never accepted large payments from CIA, reasoning that sudden wealth or lifestyle changes would trigger counterintelligence interest. He accepted modest amounts that made the relationship appear normal if discovered, but weren't sufficient to change his life circumstances visibly. He maintained his cover as a devoted Soviet officer perfectly, never giving colleagues or superiors reason to question his loyalty. The tradecraft employed standard espionage techniques adapted to Polyakov's circumstances. Dead drops, hidden locations where he could leave documents or microfilm for CIA to retrieve without direct contact. Minimized face-to-face meetings that could be observed. Signal sites, innocent-appearing marks that conveyed messages like drop loaded or meeting requested, enabled communication without electronic transmissions that signals intelligence could intercept. Meetings occurred infrequently, sometimes months apart, reducing exposure to surveillance that might detect patterns. Family protection concerns influenced every operational decision. CIA offered to exfiltrate Polyakov multiple times, particularly as his career advanced and his value increased. Each time, Polyakov refused. He feared that his disappearance would result in KGB retaliation against his family, even if they were innocent of his activities. He chose to remain in place despite escalating risk, prioritizing his family's safety and the intelligence mission over his personal survival. The intelligence Polyakov provided during his China assignment deserves special attention. The period from 1962 to 1965 coincided with the Sino-Soviet split becoming irreversible and Chinese nuclear weapons development reaching critical stages. Polyakov reported Soviet assessments of Chinese capabilities, documented technology transfers that Soviet leadership later regretted, and provided insights into border tensions that nearly escalated to war in 1969. This intelligence enabled American policy to exploit divisions between communist powers, pursuing different strategies toward Moscow and Beijing rather than treating them as a unified threat. The 19-year span of Polyakov's espionage from 1961 to 1980 represented nearly continuous access to Soviet military intelligence as his career advanced. Early in his relationship with CIA, he held relatively junior positions with limited but valuable access. As he was promoted through GRU ranks, eventually achieving general officer status, his access expanded proportionally. Senior positions provided broader perspectives on Soviet strategy and access to information junior officers never saw. The intelligence products Polyakov provided numbered in the thousands of pages of documents, hundreds of microfilm images, and countless verbal briefings during meetings with CIA handlers. The material covered virtually every aspect of Soviet military capability that GRU touched, which was substantial given the GRU's broad mandate. American intelligence analysts processing Polyakov's information could cross-reference it with information from other sources, validating its accuracy while using it to interpret other intelligence that might otherwise be ambiguous. The undetected operation for 19 years represented both Polyakov's skill at maintaining cover and the limitations of Soviet counterintelligence during this period. The KGB and GRU both conducted counterintelligence operations designed to detect foreign penetrations of Soviet intelligence services. But those efforts focused more on diplomats, scientists, and officials with political access than on career military intelligence officers like Polyakov, whose loyalty seemed beyond question. The relationship ended in 1980 when Polyakov retired from active GRU service. CIA maintained contact during his retirement, but the intelligence flow reduced dramatically as he no longer held positions providing access to current information. For the next 5 years, Polyakov lived quietly in Moscow, a retired general enjoying the modest privileges his rank provided. He had survived nearly 2 decades of espionage. He had provided intelligence that shaped the Cold War's trajectory, and he had every reason to believe he had escaped detection. He was wrong. The betrayal that would end his life was already in motion, conducted by someone within CIA itself. Aldrich Ames joined the CIA in 1962, the same year Polyakov became an active CIA agent. Ames spent his entire career in CIA, working primarily in counterintelligence and Soviet operations. He had access to information about CIA sources in the Soviet Union, including knowledge of agent identities, communication methods, and operational details. This access was necessary for his legitimate duties coordinating counterintelligence efforts. It also provided the information he would sell to Soviet intelligence when financial problems and personal grievances motivated him to betray his country. In 1985, Ames made contact with Soviet intelligence and offered his services. Unlike Polyakov's ideologically motivated espionage, Ames was motivated by money and resentment. He was in debt. He was bitter about his career progression. He was convinced that he was undervalued by CIA, despite his mediocre performance. The Soviets offered him substantial payments for information. He accepted. One of the first pieces of information Ames provided was the identity of Dmitri Polyakov. Along with Polyakov, Ames revealed more than 10 other CIA sources within the Soviet Union, compromising virtually the entire CIA human intelligence network that had taken decades to develop. The KGB and GRU received lists of names, operational details, and enough information to identify agents even when Ames didn't know their true names. The KGB investigation into Polyakov began in 1985, 6 years after his retirement. KGB counterintelligence initiated surveillance, watching Polyakov's movements, monitoring his communications, investigating his career for anomalies that might indicate espionage. The investigation proceeded carefully. KGB wanted not just to confirm Polyakov's betrayal, but to understand its scope, what he had provided, how he had operated, whether others were involved. For nearly a year, Polyakov remained unaware he was under investigation. The surveillance was professional, discreet, providing no obvious indication that KGB considered him suspect. He continued his retirement activities, meeting with former colleagues, maintaining the routines of a retired officer. CIA had no way to warn him. The Ames betrayal was so comprehensive that any attempt to warn compromised sources risked revealing to Soviets that CIA knew about the betrayal, which might enable them to protect Ames and continue exploiting his access. The arrest came in July 1986. KGB officers detained Polyakov at his Moscow apartment. They charged him with treason, espionage, and betrayal of the Soviet Union. The evidence they presented, documents he had photographed, information he had provided, details of his meetings with CIA handlers, left no possibility of denial. Polyakov was guilty of precisely what they accused him of, and they had proof. The trial occurred before a secret military tribunal in 1988. Military tribunals for espionage cases were standard Soviet practice, particularly for cases involving military officers. The proceedings were classified, attended only by tribunal members, prosecutors, and Polyakov himself. No defense attorney argued for leniency. No public announcement of the trial occurred until after sentence had been carried out. The conviction was predetermined. Soviet law considered espionage, particularly espionage benefiting the main adversary during the Cold War, the highest form of treason. The only possible sentence was death. The tribunal pronounced Polyakov guilty and sentenced him to execution by firing squad. The execution was carried out in 1988. The details remain classified in Russian archives, but the standard procedure involved transport to a prison where executions were conducted, a final brief period for the condemned to make statements, and death by firing squad. Polyakov was 67 years old when he died, having spent the previous 2 years imprisoned awaiting trial and execution. The Soviet government revealed the case publicly in 1990, during the glasnost period when previously classified information was being released. The announcement served multiple purposes. It warned potential Western agents that betrayal would be discovered and punished. It demonstrated KGB effectiveness at catching spies despite Polyakov's 19 years of undetected espionage, and it closed the case publicly, enabling Soviet authorities to move past it. CIA response came after the Soviet announcement made acknowledgement possible. The agency confirmed Polyakov's service, praising his courage and the intelligence he had provided over nearly 2 decades. Posthumously, CIA awarded Polyakov the Intelligence Star, the agency's second highest decoration, recognizing his extraordinary contribution to American national security. The recognition couldn't change Polyakov's fate, but it honored his service and sacrifice. The family aftermath was less severe than historical Soviet practice would have predicted. Polyakov's wife and children were not imprisoned, an unusual restraint given that families of convicted traitors typically faced punishment. They were resettled to provincial areas away from Moscow and lived under surveillance, but they retained their freedom. The relative leniency might have reflected changing Soviet policies during the glasnost period, or recognition that Polyakov's family had been innocent of his activities. The consequences for Aldrich Ames wouldn't become apparent until 1994. CIA had initiated an internal investigation after the 1985 compromise of multiple sources, recognizing that only a mole within CIA itself could have provided the comprehensive information Soviets clearly possessed. The investigation eventually focused on Ames after years of analyzing who had access to the compromised information. His arrest in 1994 led to conviction and life imprisonment. Polyakov's sacrifice led directly to the mole hunt that eventually identified Ames, though it came too late to save Polyakov and the other agents Ames had betrayed. The legacy of Polyakov's service extended beyond the intelligence he provided to the example he set. He knew the risks when he began working with CIA. He understood that Soviet counterintelligence would execute him if discovered. He refused multiple opportunities to defect and accept safety in the West because he believed he could accomplish more by remaining in place. He worked for 19 years, providing intelligence that shaped Cold War policy and military planning. His choice to prioritize mission effectiveness over personal safety represented dedication that inspired intelligence professionals on both sides of the Cold War divide. The question that troubled CIA officers familiar with the Polyakov case was how Soviet counterintelligence failed to detect him for 19 years. Understanding this failure reveals both the strengths of Polyakov's operational security and the limitations of Soviet counterintelligence during this period. Polyakov's operational security was meticulous. He minimized exposure by accepting infrequent meetings with CIA handlers, sometimes allowing months to pass between direct contacts. He used dead drops and signal sites rather than face-to-face meetings whenever possible, reducing the opportunities for surveillance to detect patterns. He maintained perfect cover as a devoted Soviet officer, never giving colleagues or superiors reason to question his loyalty. The psychological profile GRU counterintelligence developed for Polyakov indicated a reliable officer. He was a combat veteran who had demonstrated loyalty through decades of service. His career advancement followed normal patterns without suspicious gaps. His personal life appeared stable, devoted to his family, living modestly within his means, maintaining appropriate social relationships with fellow officers. Nothing in his behavior suggested the duplicity of someone living a double life. KGB blind spots contributed to Polyakov's survival. Counterintelligence focused more attention on diplomats, scientists, and civilian officials with Western contacts than on career military intelligence officers like Polyakov. The assumption was that military officers, particularly combat veterans who had proven themselves throughout long careers, were less vulnerable to Western recruitment than civilians who might be swayed by ideology or material benefits. This assumption proved false in Polyakov's case, but it reflected Soviet thinking about loyalty patterns. The institutional rivalry between GRU and KGB created operational gaps. The two intelligence services competed rather than cooperated fully. GRU officers faced less intensive KGB counterintelligence scrutiny than KGB officers themselves, because KGB was reluctant to appear distrustful of its sibling service. Polyakov, as a GRU officer, operated in a space where counterintelligence oversight was less comprehensive than it would have been for someone in KGB positions. Technology limitations during the 1960s and 1970s meant that surveillance wasn't as comprehensive as it would become in later decades. Soviet counterintelligence couldn't monitor every officer continuously. Electronic surveillance was limited. Communications intercepts faced technical challenges. Physical surveillance required substantial personnel resources and could only be applied selectively to individuals already under suspicion. Polyakov, having never triggered suspicion, never faced the intensive surveillance that might have detected his activities. The career trajectory Polyakov followed provided no anomalies that might trigger investigation. He received assignments appropriate to his rank and experience. His promotions occurred at normal intervals. His performance evaluations were positive without being so exceptional as to seem suspicious. He maintained the profile of a competent, loyal officer, advancing through normal career progression. His personal life showed similar absence of warning signs. He lived on his salary without unexplained wealth. He didn't engage in suspicious travel or maintain contacts with Westerners beyond what his official duties required. His family relationships appeared normal. His social circle consisted of fellow military officers and their families. Nothing indicated the stress and deception inherent in conducting espionage for nearly 2 decades. Only the Ames betrayal enabled KGB to identify Polyakov. Without information from a source inside CIA, Soviet counterintelligence had no indicators suggesting Polyakov was compromised. The investigation that followed the Ames information quickly confirmed Polyakov's activities once they knew to look, but absent that initial tip, Soviet counterintelligence might never have suspected him. The legacy of Dmitri Polyakov's espionage career, betrayal, and execution continues to influence intelligence operations and policy more than 3 decades after his death. The intelligence impact was substantial enough that CIA Director Casey's assessment that Polyakov was the most valuable Cold War source remains accepted within the intelligence community. Single sources rarely shape policy directly, but Polyakov's nearly 2-decade span of providing current intelligence on Soviet capabilities enabled American policymakers to negotiate arms control agreements from positions of knowledge, to develop weapons systems matched to actual Soviet capabilities, rather than worst-case assumptions, and to avoid strategic surprise that might have led to miscalculation and crisis. Policy influence extended beyond military planning to diplomatic negotiations. The intelligence Polyakov provided informed American positions in Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, SALT, negotiations in Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces, INF, treaty discussions and in other arms control forums where understanding Soviet capabilities and intentions was essential to reaching agreements both sides could verify. The intelligence helped prevent arms race spirals by enabling accurate assessment of threats rather than exaggerated fears based on incomplete information. Military planning benefited from understanding Soviet operational concepts. NATO force postures in Europe incorporated insights from Polyakov's intelligence about Soviet war plans. American strategic force development reflected knowledge of Soviet capabilities that satellite reconnaissance couldn't reveal. Training and doctrine adapted to counter-Soviet approaches that Polyakov had documented. The intelligence shaped how American and Allied military forces prepared for potential conflict throughout the Cold War's final decades. Strategic Defense Initiative policy drew on intelligence about Soviet anti-ballistic missile programs and strategic defense thinking. Understanding what Soviet systems could and couldn't do informed American decisions about pursuing ballistic missile defense, about negotiating ABM treaty limitations, and about assessing whether proposed defense systems could work against actual Soviet capabilities. The human cost Polyakov paid, execution after years of imprisonment, serves as a reminder of the stakes in intelligence operations. Espionage isn't an abstract policy game. Real people risk their lives to provide information. When they're caught, they face consequences up to and including death. Polyakov knew these risks and accepted them. His choice reflected convictions about serving a cause he believed in despite personal cost. The inspiration Polyakov provided to others considering cooperation with Western intelligence shouldn't be understated. His story demonstrated that individuals could make a difference, that single sources could provide intelligence shaping policy and preventing conflict. Other Soviet and later Russian citizens who cooperated with Western intelligence made their decisions knowing about sources like Polyakov, who had made similar choices. The example influenced recruitment throughout the latter Cold War period. CIA lessons from the Polyakov case focused initially on the intelligence value of long-term agents in place versus defectors providing snapshot information. The comparison suggested that accepting higher risk to keep sources in place rather than quickly exfiltrating them could yield intelligence benefits worth the risk. But the Ames betrayal forced reassessment. After losing Polyakov and multiple other sources in 1985, CIA intensified counterintelligence efforts to protect future agents from similar betrayals. The agency never fully recovered from the 1985 Year of the Spy, when Ames and other American traitors compromised CIA's Soviet human intelligence network. The loss of Polyakov and other key sources crippled CIA operations against the Soviet Union during the final years of the Cold War. Rebuilding the agent networks took years and never achieved the comprehensive penetration that existed before the betrayals. The damage extended beyond lost intelligence to psychological impact on potential sources who saw what happened to agents Western intelligence had promised to protect. Modern remembrance within CIA includes annual recognition of Polyakov's service. His sacrifice is taught at CIA training facilities as an example of dedication and courage. Officers handling sources in hostile environments are reminded of the responsibility they bear to protect those sources and of the consequences when protection fails. Polyakov's case studies inform counterintelligence training, operational security procedures, and handling practices designed to prevent future compromises. The Moscow perspective on Polyakov remains cautionary rather than celebratory. Russian intelligence services study his case as example of penetration they failed to detect for nearly 2 decades. The lesson they draw emphasizes the necessity of comprehensive counterintelligence, the danger of assuming that certain categories of officers are immune to recruitment, and the importance of maintaining defensive security even in peacetime. The case also reminds them that moles within Western intelligence, like Ames, provide the most reliable method for identifying penetrations of their own services. Post-Cold War Russian statements about Polyakov have been limited but revealing. When Soviet authorities announced his case in 1990, they used it as warning about consequences of betrayal, while also acknowledging the effectiveness of his espionage. In more recent years, Russian commentary has focused on Ames's betrayal of Polyakov, suggesting that Western intelligence agencies fail to protect their sources adequately, and that Russians considering cooperation with Western intelligence should remember what happened to Polyakov when CIA's internal security failed. The moral complexity of Polyakov's case challenges simple narratives. From Soviet and Russian perspectives, he was a traitor who betrayed his country for nearly 2 decades, providing intelligence to the main adversary during the Cold War's most dangerous periods. His execution represented appropriate punishment for treason under Soviet law. From Western perspectives, he was a hero who risked everything to provide intelligence that prevented war, shaped arms control, and contributed to the Cold War's eventual peaceful conclusion. Both perspectives reflect truth. Polyakov betrayed his oaths as a Soviet officer. He also provided intelligence that may have prevented conflict and saved lives. The question of whether individual espionage can be morally justified when motivated by conviction rather than material gain remains debated in intelligence ethics. Polyakov believed the Soviet system was corrupt and harmful to his country. He chose to provide intelligence to Soviet adversaries, hoping that better American understanding of Soviet capabilities would lead to policies reducing conflict risk. Whether this justified betraying his oaths, endangering his colleagues, and providing intelligence potentially harmful to legitimate Soviet security interests depends on moral frameworks that reasonable people assess differently. November 12, 1961. Lieutenant Colonel Dmitri Polyakov approached American intelligence offering his services. He worked for CIA for 19 years, providing intelligence that shaped Cold War policy and military planning. The KGB never suspected him during those 19 years of active espionage. Only a traitor within CIA itself enabled Soviet counterintelligence to identify and eventually execute him. The KGB believed their system was perfect, that no one would betray the Soviet Union from conviction rather than coercion or corruption. They assumed career military officers like Polyakov were immune to Western recruitment. They focused counterintelligence resources on categories of officials they considered vulnerable while giving insufficient attention to officers whose loyalty seemed beyond question. General Dmitri Polyakov spent 19 years proving them wrong. He demonstrated that conviction could motivate espionage as powerfully as money or blackmail. He showed that operational security and careful tradecraft could defeat counterintelligence surveillance for decades. He provided intelligence that influenced American policy throughout the Cold War's most dangerous period. The price he paid was his life. The KGB executed him in 1988, 2 years after his arrest. His family survived, resettled and monitored, but not imprisoned. His legacy within CIA remains honored, his service remembered as exemplifying the sacrifice intelligence sources sometimes make in service of causes they believe in. The question remains whether his sacrifice achieved what he hoped. Did the intelligence he provided actually help end the Cold War peacefully? Did American understanding of Soviet capabilities, derived partly from Polyakov's information, enable policies that reduced conflict risk? The definitive answer is unknowable. Policy results from countless factors, and attributing outcomes to single sources oversimplifies complex historical processes. But CIA Director Casey's assessment suggests senior American officials believed Polyakov's intelligence mattered substantially. The arms control agreements negotiated during the Cold War's final decades incorporated verification provisions informed by knowledge of Soviet capabilities Polyakov helped provide. The Strategic Defense Initiative debates drew on understanding of Soviet systems Polyakov had documented. NATO force postures in Europe reflected insights from Soviet military plans Polyakov revealed. The Cold War ended without the nuclear conflict both sides feared. Many factors contributed to that outcome. Economic pressures on the Soviet system, political changes under Gorbachev, Western military capabilities that deterred Soviet aggression, diplomatic negotiations that reduced tensions. Among those factors, intelligence enabling accurate assessment of capabilities and intentions rather than worst-case assumptions helped create conditions where negotiation could succeed. Dmitri Polyakov provided that intelligence for 19 years. He worked knowing that discovery meant death. He refused opportunities to defect because he believed he could accomplish more by remaining in place. He prioritized his mission over his safety. When betrayed by an American traitor, he faced the consequences he had always known awaited if his espionage was discovered. The KGB expected loyalty from Soviet military officers. They never expected that a general, a combat veteran, a career GRU officer would work for CIA for 2 decades. General Polyakov proved their expectations wrong. And in doing so, he shaped intelligence history and contributed to the Cold War's outcome in ways that remain relevant decades after his execution.